Well, welcome to the third and final session of our Salon series on leadership in crisis, sponsored by the Society of 1918. My name is Susan McGill, and I'm delighted to serve as the moderator this afternoon. Thank you for joining women who range from the class of 1939 to the class of 2020, as we continue exploring how leaders have approached crisis with a special emphasis on women leaders. As we begin, let's recall the themes of our sessions and the accompanying essays. They include the importance of organizational values and culture, execution, communication, and innovation. These are the lens through which we have explored past leadership challenges and successes. Now we will turn to see how they might inform our efforts in leadership crisis today and those that we might face in the future. Our format today is a little different because we'll cover two important but distinct topics outlined in the essays you've received on Monday. First, we're going to look at how our alma mater, under the leadership of President Rowe and the Board of Visitors, is navigating the pandemic and social justice challenges. Those of you who participated in earlier sessions know that we've given President Rowe and her team very high marks for how they're handling things. Our second topic is the power of women acting collectively to catalyze change. And I must say that our Society of 1918 is an outstanding example of women joining together around a common cause. So let's first turn until about 4:45 to a discussion with our panelists about William and Mary during the current crisis. We will then shift to women acting collectively until 5 o'clock, followed by breakout sessions on this topic until 5:15, and we'll wrap up at 5:30. We want this session to be as interactive as possible, so please place your comments and questions in the chat function, and I will ask the panelists to respond to as many as possible. The discussion breakouts will also give you the opportunity to explore women acting collectively. We have an excellent panel today. Fran and Goran and Carol O'Connell have been my collaborators throughout this process, and they authored the 6 insightful essays which have framed the Salon series. I know you join me in thanking them for all their research and their writing to pull these materials together for us. I think they've been an important part of our learning process. Val Cushman and Ivana Marshall have provided exceptionally strong support, for which we are most grateful. Fran was a consulting partner at Price Waterhouse and PwC, holding top positions in their US and global leadership teams. She also served for over 20 years on the Mason School of Business Foundation Board. And very importantly, she was the inaugural chair of the Society of 1918. We would not be here today if Fran and other women had not stepped up collectively to create the Society of 1918. I know you join me in thanking Fran and these other founders of the Society. Carol O'Connell was a career intelligence professional and held senior positions in the CIA, serving in Washington and abroad. She also served as a senior advisor at the State Department and the military. Prior to entering government service, she taught at George Mason University. We are very fortunate to have with us today 2 distinguished guest panelists. Barbara Johnson was appointed by Governor McAuliffe in 2017 to William and Mary's Board of Visitors. She's a member of the Executive Committee and is Board Secretary. She previously served as President and Vice President of the Law School Foundation. Barbara also chairs the board of the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies, as well as the National Employment Law Council. She earned her bachelor degree in chemistry from Hampton University and her JD from William and Mary. After working with Dow Chemical and various law firms, she founded B.L. Johnson in 2016 and specializes in the representation of management in labor and employment matters. Barbara, I know your fellow members of the Society of 1918 join me in thanking you for your deep commitment to William & Mary and for joining us today.
Thank you.
Last year, President Rowe tapped Jeremy Martin to be her chief of staff. Jeremy's ties to William & Mary are deep in that he previously served as an assistant to the president and associate provost. He earned his PhD in educational policy, planning, and leadership from William & Mary. Jeremy graduated from Houghton College and later earned an MBA and a master's degree in sports administration. He's at the center of navigating a lot of the crisis William & Mary is facing today, and we very much appreciate his joining us. So let's jump right into the topic of William & Mary and the pandemic. School classes are scheduled to begin in the next few weeks. So I'd ask Barbara, I'd ask Jeremy, sort of what keeps you awake at night? What are you worried about as we move into the next few months? Barbara, you want to take it first?
Sure. Well, obviously the pandemic, COVID-19, is front and center. And the key question is, how do we keep our students, how do we keep our staff, keep everyone safe? So that's really paramount on everyone's mind, as well as how do we continue to deliver the quality of education that William & Mary is known for. So that's got to be front and center, is front and center in our thinking. But we're also very much concerned about the mood of the country right now, especially when it comes to the Black Lives Matters movement, the demand for more diversity, inclusion, and equity across the board in general, and particularly at William & Mary. And so those are the things that at least are front and center in my mind right now.
A lot. That's a lot.
For me last night, it was thinking about standing in for President Rowe with the Society of 1918, but it's wonderful to see.
Well, Jeremy, we are
tall order.
Jeremy, we are delighted to have you. You're very welcome.
It's actually wonderful to see so many friendly faces. And if I haven't met you yet, I hope that at the next homecoming that we're in person, or Charter Day, or one of those events, that our paths will cross in person. But Catherine, by the way, does send her sincere regrets and look forward to being with you soon. I've never been mistaken for her. I've occasionally been mistaken for a bodyguard for the president. But anyway, we were actually talking and sort of getting prepared for this, and it was an interesting occasion to do it because yesterday, in two benches that were at least 12 feet apart on the Wren Yard, we sat and just had about an hour conversation to check in and say, you know, how things are going on. And for Catherine, you're keenly aware in any conversation just how seriously she takes the safety and the wellness of the community, the students, the faculty and staff, and everyone who comes to visit campus. And when you do the math on that, that's 12,000 individuals who either learn or are employed at William & Mary, and there are another 100,000 alumni beyond that. And so that's a heavy responsibility. And one of the things that makes it an even larger responsibility at present is all of you've heard Catherine talk about values. We're now explicit in what our values at William & Mary are, and the very real tensions that a value like flourishing and creating the conditions for William & Mary to thrive for all time coming, in contrast with the value like belonging, when you recognize just how sincere and legitimate the pressing issues of the time are. And so she actually directly mentioned that, as if you ask her what she loses sleep over, it's managing those values and for an entire population.
I think Fran and Barbara would join me in this as we look at how you all have handled that and the communications that have come out. The values are really front and center there, and I think that's been a very positive thing as we try to sort through all this. Barbara, I believe that the Board of Visitors, that there actually had to be a statutory change for the board to be able to meet virtually. And I'm just wondering, how is that working out? What's it like to be a member of the board at such a critical time? And are you having a little bit of different perceptions of maybe the path forward than the administration? Not that we'll tell Jeremy, but how's all that working out? It's got to be difficult to be working from your homes.
Well, first of all, yes, there did have to be special legislation that allows us to conduct business virtually, remotely. And unfortunately, we have been able to conduct board meetings as well as executive committee meetings through Zoom. And that works reasonably well. I mean, on one hand, we can lament the fact that we can't be together, but on the other hand, we're grateful for the technology, which frankly didn't exist 10 or 15 years ago, that allows us to at least be able to meet virtually. So we've had several meetings. I think they've gone reasonably well. One of the challenges is it's kind of difficult to sense the energy in the room when you're remote, and so things do feel a little bit awkward. But in terms of conducting business, I feel as if we've done that successfully. And certainly there are divergent views on the board with respect to the best path forward, but I think everyone's views are important, and ultimately it's the resolutions that we pass which are the real voice of the board. And at this point, I think it's fair to say that we certainly support the administration. We certainly support Dean Rowe. I was part of the Board of Visitors when she was selected to lead William and Mary, and thrilled with that appointment. But on the other hand, we hold her accountable. I mean, we hold her accountable um, for moving forward in the way that is consistent with the values of the university in all aspects. And so I think at this point, I feel as if we are aligned. I also feel as if there's a certain amount of pressure. And as she says very often, you know, it's the speed of change, right? It's the speed with which we have had to address COVID-19 and all of these other issues. And frankly, it's only going to get harder. That's hard to accept when you think about how hard it's been, but the reality is it's probably going to get harder. And so the board, I think, is committed to working really, really hard to develop to provide the oversight, develop the strategies, but once again, to approve and bless the approaches that are going to bring about tremendous change. I mean, this is a time of phenomenal, just unbelievable change, and being prepared to move, frankly, more quickly than universities typically move. I mean, I think it's going to be necessary and mandatory going forward.
I think you're certainly sounds like the lots of challenges there, but that it's going well. I do want to remind everyone that please put any questions or comments you have in chat, and we'll try to get to those. I guess that really leads to another question, maybe for you, Jeremy. It seemed like the pivot to online learning last spring was a bit rocky in some places, very well in other places. But how have you learned from that? Are we going to see anything different this fall? Can you speak a bit to that?
Well, if I may, and said in all admiration and respect, I'm a two-time William and Mary alumnus, and so say this in full appreciation of the faculty. But if I asked you to pause for a moment and to think of the adjective that you would describe your favorite William and Mary professors with, I don't know that tech savvy would be one of the first ones that came to mind. And so when you think about transitioning 2,000 courses literally within 10 days, I mean, it was 7 to 10 days, and we said, you're going to come out of this and we're going to be in a remote format. I think what we actually had was an uneven experience. So you had some faculty for whom, frankly, this was moving into maybe a more comfortable realm, and you had other faculty for whom it was a larger struggle. And so one of the things we've done, the Studio for Teaching and Learning Innovation has been incredibly engaged. There are currently 400 faculty members, and for frame of reference, that's between 50 and 60% of our instructional faculty are engaged in planning for remote instruction work through the studio. So that's one piece. And the second part is, frankly, when you begin a semester, if you think back to January, and it feels like an eternity ago, we weren't preparing at the outset of that semester to say, hey, we may have to pivot here in this semester. If you look at the ways even that we've designated courses for the fall and the format that they'll be offered. We've been looking ahead saying, hey, there's a possibility that you may have to pivot at least once and potentially twice the semester. So the easiest answer to that question is better preparation and better runway time to get folks who may have a more difficult transition to a remote format, to get them up to speed, to say, here are the tools that are available to you. Because the one thing that we know, and that Catherine and the provost have been adamant about, the expectations of quality don't change when the delivery mode does. People come to William & Mary, whether it's in person or whether it's via their via a remote instruction tool, they come to William & Mary expecting to have a world-class experience. And so we're grateful for 3 months to prepare to offer that for them in the fall.
And that was one of my questions, is how can you continue to assure that they will get that world-class education? It sounds like you're moving in different directions to try to do that. What percentage of classes, do you have any idea, will be virtual this fall? Do we know that yet? Maybe not.
We have rough estimate. Well, we know within the general range, so there's going to be some flexibility between it, but basically, and it varies by school, by the way. So some schools are planning to be more remote than others. Interestingly enough, the law schools, its preliminary estimate is that about 60% of its courses will be offered in a remote format. We began by asking faculty what format they intended to offer it in. And I should say that this is a spectrum. So in some ways you might just want to say, is a course online or in person? There are basically 6 points along a spectrum that we've used to ask faculty to describe their delivery mode. And so you would think of some in person, some remote, and that might be for a larger course, or you might have alternate days where you attend the lecture one day, there's remote work the next, and then the next group attends, and those sorts of things. So about 6 points on that spectrum. In arts and sciences, which is where the majority of the undergraduate student body is, we expect about 40% of instruction to be fully online and 60% to begin the semester with some form of blended learning along that spectrum of saying you're not expected to be in person every day or every class period. And so there's going to be a remote element to this class. All the way through, remote asynchronous would be the most distant education format in which you're providing the content and it's not expected that everyone's getting together at the same time, even in a remote tool.
So maybe we should add, because I think some of the questions and the discussions, let's add the very important topic of racial justice at this point as well. We'll continue to talk about the pandemic in classes, but there's so many things that really you're looking at, I'm sure, as a whole. And I couldn't help but thinking that this week, as we mourn the loss of Congressman John Lewis, some of you may know and others may not that he received an honorary degree from William & Mary in 2003 at commencement. So he is a member of the tribe. He was a member of the tribe. Queen Noor of Jordan was the keynote speaker. It was quite a scramble before the ceremony began. Maybe you were there, Jeremy, I don't know. But Queen Noor made it very clear that she would sing, she would dance, she would do anything we asked her to do, but she would not speak after John Lewis. And that's where she was scripted in the program. She was a very, very wise woman. So I don't want to speak, I wouldn't want to speak after Congressman Lewis either, but it seemed appropriate today to paraphrase a few of the things that he said to the students that day, to all of us that day at commencement, because I think his message remains very compelling. Do not get lost in a sea of despair. Be hopeful, be optimistic, exercise love, and get in good trouble, necessary trouble. I think that speaks just as well today as it did back in 2003, and maybe even more so. And that sort of leads us into a couple of questions that have come up, and one that I had, because you talked about, Barbara, you talked about changes. We talked a little bit about innovation. So what really, for those of us who've been been involved with William & Mary for a number of years, we now, even though we had strong women leaders over the decades, we now have our first woman president. Give us your thoughts on what do you see as the hard changes that are coming faster, and are there innovative things that you'll be implementing that you've sort of learned through this crisis period?
I think the hardest thing to deal with is the uncertainty. And people can put up with a certain amount of uncertainty, okay? And then it's like, okay, we need certainty now, and we don't have certainty. And that's part of what I mean when I say things will get harder and harder. We don't know if there's going to be another outbreak in the fall. We don't know if we get started and we have to send students home. We don't know. And parents want to know, students want to know, staff wants to know, everybody wants to know, and we don't have answers. And what I mean is we're going to have to make decisions very quickly, recognizing somebody's not going to be happy. I mean, there's somebody is not going to be happy ultimately with the decisions that we make. And that's where I think those values become really important. We have to look at what's important to William and Mary from a value standpoint and make those decisions in accordance with those values, recognizing that some people are not going to be happy. And probably the best example I can give of what's going to be harder and harder is looking at the names on campus. As you know, there is a whole group that is a committee that's been appointed to look at naming buildings on campus and how those buildings should be named. And there are probably going to be some people one way or the other that are not going to be happy with that decision, because it is going to require questioning of things that we've always taken for granted. But at the end of the day, as long as those decisions are made in a way that's consistent with our values, I think we'll be fine. But that's what I mean when I say things will get harder and harder, because there will be a group of people, regardless of what decisions are made going forward, a probably significant group of people who will not be happy.
Yeah.
Susan, if I could piggyback on that one, I'm going to attempt to actually catch a couple of questions in the chat. Susan and Laurie, I saw questions from you as well. So if you think about all 7 of William and Mary's values are marvelous, and Ginger Ambler and Sean Glover, Dr. Ambler and Dr. Glover, were among the writing groups that sort of fashioned them. The one that gets the most attention is this value of belonging. And it's a fascinating study in the current moment, but also when you think about what some remote activity at William and Mary means. For most of us on the call, I'm assuming that your William and Mary experience didn't include a majority of remote instruction and that possibility. I will say that Student Affairs is very intent on what it means to participate in clubs and organizations, sort of in the rites of fall and that kind of thing when we can't do them in person. And among the real challenges when you think about it, what does not having homecoming look like in the fall when you're talking about alumni engagement? So they are actively considering those, even as students come back. And one of the things we're actually hearing from most students is we have gotten a surprising indication of willingness to comply in that spirit of belonging with being on campus. And part of that being, I think that many of the students are tired of being home with mom and dad. No offense to any mothers or fathers, but literally I will wear a mask to the bathroom if you ask me to, if I can just get out of this house. I would like to go back to school. Is one piece. And we've also seen within that belonging, there are some ways in which the learning content is more accessible in those formats. So if you think about having a closed caption lecture because it was recorded and you could close caption it for someone who's hearing impaired and things like that, we've actually experienced in some meetings that there are some colleagues that we didn't know had varying levels of hearing comfort, and they're actually saying that they prefer a Zoom meeting because they can actually hear everything that's going on. So those 2 things are definitely front of mind. I would echo everything that Barbara just said on that particular front, and it was really important. I mean, I think that the dominant thing, and just having asked the Williamsburg community today, we sent out a message asking for their feedback for the working group on naming and renaming. And it's a complicated piece, and it's been fascinating, the questions that it opens for a community. And so I think if you take a moment, I don't mean to not name other individuals who have been killed in this time, but if you take a moment to recall the murder of George Floyd, and whether or not you've watched the video, one of the really just fascinating pieces of the imagery of it is you have a person in a passive stance with their hands in their pockets and kneeling, actively killing another human being. And so one of the pieces that's opened a lot of doors to conversations is literally a societal question of saying, are we passively being actively engaged in harming another individual? And so it's one of the questions that if you haven't had a chance to watch it, our student body president, who Anthony Joseph, better known as AJ, 2 board meetings ago, gave one of the most powerful student addresses I've ever heard. And I sent him a note afterward, and AJ spoke. And then you look at folks like Ms. Johnson on the board, and Dr. Buck, and Mr. Wolfick, and Mr. Branch, and you hear them speak. And he used a term that I had not heard the same way before he said it out loud. He used a term of ancestral pain. And you might think of that in the larger culture as one thing. When you saw other members of the William and Mary family react to that term, and you say, here's someone who is part of my tribe that has experienced our campus or has experienced something about our culture very differently than I experienced it. That's a very different realization as you're exploring those things. And so one of the ways that Catherine has dealt with this, there was a very well-meaning alum that sent her a message, and she thought long and hard about how she was going to respond to this. And the effect of the message was, this was an alum, I specifically am not using alumna or alumnus, but an alum who graduated from William and Mary around in the early 1950s, so in the earliest years of 1950s. And the effect of the comment was something along the lines of, there was nothing wrong with the William and Mary I attended. And so the line, in a short response, it thanked for some other information, that kind of thing, that Catherine chose to engage that person on, was to say, concluding line was, however, I have to disagree that there was nothing wrong with the segregated William and Mary you attended. And for that person, they had a wonderful William and Mary experience. But as we think about with one another, hey, what does it mean for you to walk on our campus? What does it mean for you to experience William and Mary? And what are the principles by which we're going to determine what's honorable and who is honored here? Those are all things that are they're really engaging discussions. And Catherine's habit is to call people in. And I appreciate that the working group is saying, come into this discussion and let's have this honestly and forthrightly with each other, but let's do it in a caring way with one another as part of the same William and Mary family, part of the same tribe.
And I believe there are opportunities. I think there's a session tomorrow and then Monday night that we can listen and participate and give our comments on that subject. Maybe we can later send the link for that. Sorry, Barbara, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, I interrupted you, I'm sorry. And I remember being in a William and Mary Law School Foundation meeting, and probably some of the folks in this call were attending the same meeting. And one of the alums was just extolling, as we were talking about a strategic plan for the law school or whatever, he was talking about the wonderful tradition of William and Mary. And one of the African-American alumni said, but that didn't include me. And you have to understand that that didn't include me and what that means when you continue to say that, because that doesn't include me, which doesn't mean that we can't honor our tradition. But I think we have to also recognize that we're flawed. I mean, the founders of this country were not perfect individuals. Everyone is flawed to some extent. I listened to a YouTube video not that long ago by a man who is a litigator for the ACLU, and he quoted this line from Jimmy Stewart in a movie called Anatomy of a Murder. And he said, we're not all, people aren't all one thing. You can be this, this, and this. You can still be a bank robber. I mean, you can be a great father and a great husband, and you can still embezzle stuff. I mean, so people aren't just one thing. The country isn't one thing. William and Mary isn't one thing. And I think we have to recognize and acknowledge that, especially as we go forward, just to make sure that all people do feel included.
That was one of our questions is, what are the barriers to making everyone feel included? And I think you and Jeremy have touched on that. I don't know if there are any other things that you want to cite at this point.
I think it is part of not appreciating that tradition has been exclusionary. And I think one of the greatest barriers is recognizing that you can still be from the class of 1950, have had a wonderful experience, but recognize that there was something wrong with that experience because it was exclusionary. And so what does need to happen to make sure that everyone is included? And that only happens if there's a certain level of awareness, a certain level of education, a certain understanding, acceptance of the issues going forward. So I think the main barrier is that people's experiences have been different, and there has been a lack of appreciation of how the experience of other people may have been different, and a willingness to change to bring those people into an environment where they do feel included. So I think the greatest obstacle is the lack of awareness, and that's where I think that the George Floyd murder, to some extent, people have said, now wait a minute, hold on, what's going on here? And I think there is more awareness, and the real key is whether it is, I call it, is it a moment or is it a movement? And, you know, is it really going to be something that is sustained, or is it just kind of a passing flash in the pan and only time can tell?
Barbara, I'd add, I think it's interesting. Most of the folks who remain engaged with William & Mary for a lifetime look at their path and recognize whether their path had a steep incline or whatever the obstacles were. They look back and they look at a William & Mary student today and they say, I want to do my part to make your path smoother, to help you find access, to help you find this opportunity and those kind of things. One of the issues that you face as well is one of the real privileges of working with the board, and I think of folks like Ms. Johnson and Dr. Buck, who's chairing this working group, it's interesting to catch them on the side at meetings, and you know, you try not to commandeer time, but you hear about their experiences. And one of the words that I would really use to describe alumni of color who've had varying experiences at William & Mary, frankly, is gracious. And I think that one of the generational barriers that we face at this moment is the current generation looks at the state of affairs that they inherit, and they say, we've waited long enough. Like, we've taken enough time to get over, you have some discomfort discussing these things or those kind of things. And so it is not that it's an ungracious posture, but we have put forth values and things, and they're actually saying, now deliver on them in a way that, you know, in a way that was, the level of the activism is not different in that its intent is any different. But the expectation and sense of urgency is significantly increased in this moment, which I do believe is a movement going to be a sustained thing you see on our campus.
Fran and Carol, you did a lot of research, particularly about how William & Mary was coping with the first few months of the pandemic and the beginning of the racial justice. Is there anything that you would like to add? Your perceptions of how all this is being addressed on campus?
Well, I think, Susan, as you pointed out, the first 4 essays sort of set a framework that Carol and I worked through in our research and our joint discussions with you. Susan was a great member of the team as well. We needed somebody who was totally objective compared to some of the first writing authors. But one of the things that we were very impressed with, and we did have access to the first 2 to 3 months worth of communications, both internal and external, from the university, as well as some other materials. So we felt very lucky that we had that insider's view. And we also we talked to some people, some of the constituents, if you will, and got their views as well. And I think we came away feeling that, as I think you pointed out, that the distance learning process and the pivot for all universities, it was very much a work in progress. It was very difficult and very daunting, but that in general, William & Mary, and specifically the leadership team under Catherine Rowe, really met most of the criteria that we found that we were judging other organizations, whether they were corporations or not-for-profits or government, by in terms of leadership traits. So it was a very pleasant exercise in that sense. We didn't really know what we'd find when we started, and we were hopeful it would be positive, and it was. Carol?
Yes, it was very positive. And I would add that it is something that's been sustained. I don't know how many of you were able to watch the town hall meeting last night. I think that link was sent as well. But I was impressed that Catherine Rowe and the board and other staff members are as committed to providing quality academic education, they're, as well as a sense of belonging that Jeremy mentioned, even to the point of buying Adirondack chairs and setting up gathering places so that students will be able to engage with each other at safe distances. So it's not just doing something on paper, but it's sustaining it to a sense, to the point where the importance of belonging is reflected in how the campus is set up. And it facilitates the easy ability to engage in a safe way.
It's very important, I think, as everyone returns to campus and the classes start. I understand that William and Mary's been very committed to engaging with the Williamsburg community. Can you talk a little bit, how is that working out today with the pandemic and the racial justice challenges? Jeremy,
I'll jump in if you don't.
any thoughts on that?
Yeah, the first thing I think is important for everybody to know is Catherine is president of William and Mary, the city manager, the mayor who's recently changed from Paul Freiling, who was a William and Mary alumnus, to Doug Pons, who's been a longtime resident, and Cliff Fleet, who's a William and Mary alumnus 2 times over, I believe, 2 times, and maybe 3 times, I'm not sure, a 2 or 3 time alumnus. They're on each other's speed dial. So occasionally you get questions like, do these folks talk? And I'm like, I don't know if they have in the last hour, but it hadn't been more than 24. So one of those pieces to just be aware of. In fairness, there's concern in the community about students coming back. One of the old jokes of living here is folks who live in Williamsburg would like William and Mary without the students and CW without the tourists. And you know, the reality is that that's not feasible either. So one of the things that we are negotiating is frankly that we have higher public health expectations of our students within a health community compact that they'll be committing to before they come back than is true of the ordinances in the city. So if any of you are local and you're walking around, it's not unusual to find people walking through campus in t-shirts and shorts, and they're out for a walk or for exercise, and they're not masked up. And we've said, if you're on our campus and you cannot guarantee that you have an uninterrupted 6 feet of space, and then you've parked yourself somewhere away from people where you are sitting down and no one is coming into your radius, you will have a mask on. And that's a different community expectation for someone who's a William and Mary person versus someone who's in the city. And so it's interesting to try to navigate those things to say, hey, for a student who's living off campus, they are subject to the exact same standards that you've created for yourself as citizens of the city. Do you know what those standards are? And are you comfortable with what that level of engagement is? But the engagement with the city is, Taylor made a really conscientious effort to improve upon that. I thought it was pretty incredible the amount of time Taylor devoted to it. It's been pretty amazing to watch Catherine take it to another level. Still, Taylor did not text as much as you might have suspected that Taylor did. Catherine is literally like, hey, have you thought about this and what's your testing protocol going to be and all those sorts of things. So the leaders of the city's major organizations are in constant contact and aware of what one is doing and moving in sync on most things.
Let me see if there's some good questions. I think we covered some of the questions in chat. Let's see. Ivana, did you see something there particularly? I think there's some compliments. There's the importance of the sunken gardens as we look at different things here.
Susan, one just appeared from Pat, and it's for Barbara. Barbara, in case you don't have the chat open, I'll read it to you.
And it's a really good question, but you have to remember that the Board of Visitors is appointed by the governor, and so we don't have any choice over the demographics of who joins us. We serve at the pleasure of whoever the governor is at the time. I do know that last year there was a Latina appointed to the board, Ambassador Aponte. And so there is a pretty good demographic mix among the 17 members of the board, but it's not a situation where we have any control over pipeline or over who gets appointed. It is a political appointment.
I did not realize that. Thank you for clarifying that.
And Susan, another question, but this one seems like it's for Jeremy in terms of naming the buildings. What is the process by which you're going to choose who gets to name the buildings? And Barbara, I think you can weigh in there too.
I think the board gets to do that in the end. As I recall from my time on the board, the administration can recommend.
Yeah, the most important thing is that there's a process. And that's what the committee that has been appointed has been, we've asked them to do, establish what the process is by which we are going to evaluate the names. And I think that there will be some movement fairly quickly with respect to some of the names, but ultimately overall, longer term, the idea is to come up with a process. And frankly, it's not just a process of unnaming, it's a process of naming as well. Because for example, there have been some recommendations about naming buildings for certain people about whom we know very little. And so it's that idea of having a process in place.
I just said, I posted in the chat, it doesn't specifically relate to the board. If you track on the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, we do have a diversity dashboard, including SWAN vendor, the growth in the student body and those sorts of things. One of the things when that's updated, I believe for the board at the August retreat, one of the things that Catherine's really proud of, we've moved the percentage of managers of color, so managers and executive leaders of color by, I want to say, 5 percentage points in a single year. With some recent hires, and I know that that's something that she's particularly thinking of. I did want to, Ivana, you picked out, if I may, and I recognize that I'm a white male. There's a question earlier in the chat about who's going to oppose renaming. Is it only going to be white men? So at great risk to my own personal health, I just want to acknowledge that was in the chat. And if I'm allowed to share a story, I think that one of the responsibilities that falls to each of us is to have conversations, whether comfortable or uncomfortable, with people that come into our sphere of influence. And so I typically field at some point, not right when they call, but we'll call back all of the problem calls, and everybody finds extension 1693 and calls the president's office. I want to let you know that this is not going well. And we call all of them back. Often it's me to just say, hey, I just want to call you back. And one of the calls that sticks out, like in memory, was an individual who called in and was asking us to take down the 50th anniversary of African American banners. And so was able to engage this person on, in a conversation. And in fairness, when you start from that premise, you might think that someone's not willing to actually engage. And so this person happened to be willing to engage and said, I want you to take down the banners. You never do that for white men. And it's one of the rare moments that the comeback immediately came to me, and I didn't have it after the thought, but I said, well, sir, we actually do. We hang banners every year in February for Charter Day when we celebrate the anniversary of when white men were able to enroll in the institution. And what we're celebrating this year is when that opportunity expanded to people of color. And next year, we're going to celebrate when it expanded to women. And it was sort of one of those things of what it actually gave that person pause to say, let me pause and actually think about what that meant. And the only thing I would say in that is we have some problematic conversations where someone has an opinion where you just say, we may never even be able to have a conversation about this. There are a whole lot of other people who have, they're not poorly intended when they come with a question. And you fairly quickly figure out whether it's someone that you can engage and say, hey, would you mind if we shared information on this? And those are the folks that you're trying to engage with. Recognizing that there's a certain population that at the end of the call, you're just going to say, we're just not able to see eye to eye on this. I appreciate you sharing your opinion. I carry every conversation I have into the next day that I live, and I'll take this forward with me too. But I don't think it's fair to just pigeonhole and say, this is the only person who's going to have a problem when you're thinking about principles that are universal.
Yeah. And I think you said something that's so important, Jeremy. I mean, I think the big challenge that we have now is to continuing those uncomfortable, courageous conversations, because we haven't had them. And it's difficult because people are afraid to talk about race. You don't want to, you don't want to say the wrong thing. You don't want to offend anybody, but it's really so important to have those courageous, difficult conversations if we're going to move the ball forward in terms of understanding how everyone feels. And, people ask me, because I've taught, I've helped employers implement diversity and inclusion programs. I mean, that's a lot of what I've done over the last number of years. But the challenge is, it's that feeling piece that's been missing, right? It's that courageous conversation of really confronting how people feel. And hopefully that's what will be different going forward, is the willingness, regardless of how you end up after the conversation, but to at least be willing to engage, to listen, and to understand.
Barbara, would you echo, that may have been Miss Rodea that just posted a comment. As someone who has stubbed their toe in more than one conversation on this front, and does so quite regularly, one of the things I've appreciated, just wondered if you'd echo this advice. You and a number of other members on the board, we've actually engaged in fairly intense conversations that normally begins with me saying, I want to acknowledge to you in advance, if I say anything that offends you in this, would you tell me right now so that I can learn from what this conversation is? And I will just say, you know, as we talk about building our communication skills and things like that, on whatever the topic is, my experience is, if you will open from that posture and you will actually learn from it. So if I repeat that same error in our next conversation, that's my problem, right? But in the first conversation, if I'll say, would you give me the grace to, if I misstep, would you inform me in this moment that I misstepped, and then let's move on from there. People will have a whole lot different conversation with you if you start from that base.
I think that's exactly right. And you both, Barbara, thank you very much for your comments. And I think it's time to move on to our next topic. But I think that's the most important message that we can take away from this, is the importance of communicating and listening to other people, particularly people with whom we think, at least initially, that we don't agree, because that's the way to move the conversation forward. So I know we very much appreciate both of your efforts in doing that. Now we're going to turn to our second topic today, which is the power of women to affect great social change when they band together around a cause or a crisis. And Barbara, we'll turn to you again. How have you been involved with, you're certainly involved now, trying to bring about change? I think we've let a few men into the conversation, including Jeremy and other members of the board, and Taylor when he was there at William & Mary. But can you talk about a time that you've worked with other women, particularly to bring about change, as we begin our conversation about women acting collectively? Jeremy, please stay and join us. We love it.
The example that came to mind for me is when I lived in Midland, Michigan, which was a small town in the middle of Michigan. And it was a very, very few people of color there, but we had sororities and we had fraternities. And I was part of a sorority that met on a regular basis. And I am still, and then and now, the sorority has just had tremendous impact in the community as a group of women who just got things done. And I've always been, and it wasn't just my sorority, there were other sororities, other fraternities of people who just got together and got things done. And I have a very good friend who's an attorney and very much a mentor, and a big part of the reason that I ended up going to law school. And she started this group of women. We would go to her house once a month and we'd write a check. The check could be for $100, $500, $1,000. It didn't matter, whatever you wanted to give. And there'd be a charity that month. And you spend like 15 minutes when you walked in, you'd write the check and that was it. And then we just give the money away. And so that would be a way for 30 to 40 women to get together, have a great get together on a Saturday or Sunday afternoon, not even think about it, but it was quite impactful if you think about doing that once a month for several years. And what I found about women acting collectively is we just kind of do it. It's not, we don't necessarily talk about it a whole lot. We just get together, and if there's a problem to be solved or an issue that needs to be addressed, we just kind of do it and move on, because it's kind of built into the psyche, if you will, or the DNA, I guess, of who we are. But that was certainly an example that I still think back on, and I'm actually still part of that group now, even remotely, and still do enjoy just seeing how, whether it's bringing groups to the Midland Center for the Arts or whatever, but just a group of women acting collectively to get things done.
Yeah, good, thank you. Well, from my experience, now we'll turn to Fran and Carol and let them chime in here for a minute. From my experience of working with women for passage of the Equal Rights Amendment, for pay equity on Capitol Hill, and recruiting more women to offer themselves for elective and appointed office, there is something, as Barbara just said, very powerful about women working collectively. Fran and Carol, what do you think? Is it anything from your research, anything that's inspired you in your life, or women leaders that you might add to the conversation at this point?
Yeah, it's interesting. Thanks, Susan. We did this essay and discussion now, what, about a month and a half ago. But just over the last week, I've been thinking about it again. And I think what spurred that actually was hearing the stories about John Lewis's life. As you said earlier, I think that's touched all of us and brought up both our memories of him and those eras he's lived through. But I also, at the same time, as I was listening to the stories about John Lewis, I was watching The Vote on PBS, and many
I've been watching it too.
Yeah, it's running again, I guess. I think it had run before, about women's suffrage. And both those sets of stories, if you will, seem to dovetail to me with the research that we did. And the research about women, primarily women's social movements. And you already mentioned it, but I have to repeat that John Lewis phrase, making good trouble. I just absolutely love it. And I think women make better good trouble than anybody. And so I really found that as we did our research, we saw that women were not afraid to stand up and make some trouble when they felt strongly. And if you look through, this last century, most of the social movements have arisen when people were trying to bend that arc of history towards justice, which I think Martin Luther King first said. And whether it was suffrage, civil rights movement, the labor movements and labor rights movements in the 20s and 30s, the gay rights activism, or the current Black Lives Matter, my view is that all those people took to the streets to really urgently try to influence their institutional leaders to bend that arc. And it was when those institutional leaders had really ignored really important social issues for some time. And each of those movements, I think, were driven by both rational and deep emotional responses to past oppression, and usually very deep oppression in some form that the individuals felt they just could not let stand any longer. And I think specifically about women's movements, our research characterized them, that they were characterized by very large numbers of women. If you've seen the pictures of any of these movements that women were involved in, most of those women, the vast majority, were anonymous, but they joined together with passion, with purpose, and with camaraderie. And I think women have had to fight for our rights as citizens, as well as self-determination from the time this country was founded to this very day. And whether it was the white dresses of suffrage or the pink hats of the 2017 Women's March, something that struck me is we always seem to do it in a very visual way that has impact. And we all remember those visions. And even, I think, if I remember right, President Wilson, when he saw those women marching for suffrage during one of his inaugurations, it moved him too, just that image alone, I think. So I was reminded again during those John Lewis eulogies that protest it's as old as our independence as a country and our democracy, and it's an American tradition. and often produces real cultural and institutional change. So to me, we women need to embrace that protest is a great tool, and be very proud of it and proud of our part in it.
Thank you, Fran. Carol, did you want to add something?
Sure. I'd like to talk for a minute about what it's like to be inside one of those movements. I took place in the Women's March in 2017 in Washington, D.C. I don't know, a number of you may have been there as well. But I found it to be a coming together of much smaller personal groups. It was not monolithic. Everybody came with a friend or was looking to find somebody she'd agreed to meet at some prearranged meeting place. Good luck with that, because there were huge crowds of people. Organization was aspirational. The crowds followed along major streets, they chanted, clapped. There was no anger, there wasn't any antipathy, there was no rioting. There was a lot of storytelling. Where are you from? How long did it take you to get here? I love your hat. Want one? My friend makes them. So I think that historical summaries can miss the intensely human and the personal nature of those marches. And it's the human connection that gives rise to the commitment and the sacrifice that's necessary for real change. And it's that intensely personal moment.
Yeah, thank you, Carol. Thank you so much. I think that's a good lead in. It's time to go into our breakout sessions. Ivana is going to help us with that. And we have a question that we would ask you to think about in this session. What, if anything, differentiates women acting collectively from other social and political movements? We'll have a facilitator in each group who can report back. We won't have much time, but just the most compelling points or interesting discussions that you had in your particular group. And also, of course, this is your time if you want to address other points that have been raised in the conversation that you haven't had a chance. And we have a lot of good comments and questions in the chat. So I'm going to turn it over to Ivana to move us into our groups. Thank you, Ivana.
And welcome back, everyone. I'm going to turn it over to Barbara and Carol. You all will give your report out for your breakout room, and our other breakout reports will come from Barbara Pate Glaseau, Lisa Rodet, Teal Hawthorne, and Pam Penny.
We talked about the attributes of women leaders, and the first image that came to mind was the wall in Portland, and how powerful it is to women in front of that, and how powerful it is to see a group of women. Generally, women acting collectively are viewed as more civil, calm, and probably less aggressive, and really being respectful of all. Women are not likely to take as big a risk as their male counterparts. And very often, even though they're women on the front lines of a movement, women are also caregivers and tend to be on the back line as well. Someone in the group who's a lobbyist talked about how so many women tend to be lobbyists because women are good at coalition building. And that's also an aspect of how women leaders function, is that coalition building. Then we talked about generational differences and how women of today are far more impatient, feel entitled to be impatient. And someone suggested it may be because of technology and the fact that you don't have to wait for much of anything these days. And need for or expectation of immediate gratification. And then just finally that we talked about the impact of Title IX and how that has led to women feeling more powerful, more entitled. We also talked about finally the idea of women acting in ways that for the benefit of others and not being driven as much by ego and being really interested in the welfare of the whole. So.
That was an excellent report, Barbara. I think you covered everything. We did also comment on how fortunate we feel that Catherine Rowe is president at the moment, that she seems to be doing all of those things that we like and admire in women and women's movements. And I think one of our participants also mentioned the Eleanor Roosevelt quote from our reading as well. So that's the word from our group.
So we talked mostly about attributes and personal experiences more than other people's experiences. And so these were the attributes that we came up with. That women tend to band together, particularly when they're in the minority. And so that becomes a supportive group to one another. And that when we do that, we're able to recognize one another's strengths, and also have the realization that we don't have to be 100% on every minute of every day, and we're willing to call on one another to kind of pick up the slack, take care of a child, help with the task we can't get done, and that we're willing to do that. And when that happens, that we get an awful lot done. That phrase was used by several people in the group, that women coming together get a lot done. We recognize the fact that I think that Barbara had said earlier, that people are many different things. They're not perfect in all things. And so we have that ability to look at those different talents and abilities. That in doing so, that often we break down objectives and tasks into simpler things to get them done. So instead of looking at one overwhelming, overarching problem, that we're able to organize around individual tasks and delegate them out when we have banded together collectively to get things done. We also mentioned, and I think Barbara and Carol's group said this, that women often are nicer about it, even when they have strong opinions, maybe more gracious, that women persevere, not that men don't, but women have had to persevere so much over obstacles in their path that we may persevere longer, that we're resourceful, that we have a higher tolerance for pain. And that is physical. Those of us who have children may identify with that. And sometimes the pain of getting things done. If we have higher tolerance for it and we have this sisterhood to help us, that we get a lot done.
So some of the comments that we talked about are obviously women uniting during a crisis, that they have usually a caring group. They're showing empathy, trust amongst the people within the group. And basically that turns out to be a lot more hopeful and optimistic generally than people who unite together who don't share those same characteristics. We said that often women collectively attack difficult problems that there isn't an obvious solution to. I think we already discussed that. If it's not done, they may not win, but they have to try. They feel like they have to give it a shot. It may not be that they'll be successful, but they have to give it a try. We also talked about the fact that women work collectively, and generally they're combining and leveraging the skills and expertise of the people in the group, that you don't generally have just one person who's taking the lead and just saying, okay, this is what we have to do. But there's much more collective experiences there. They're trying to look to see what other people can add to the group, their skills, their experiences. And as far as specific examples, we talked about the Wall of Moms and how they were protecting the protesters and showing empathy, and obviously collectively they were coming out to be a strong force for change. We talked about Liberia, from Shonda had experience there, and the fact that women prayed together every day. They came together collectively to share their thoughts, and with that really they were able to stop a war over there just based on that collective activity. And then the last one was Finland. We talked about how there are 5 political parties there. There's a woman prime minister, but yet the 5 political parties that are running that country are all led by women. So you've got a coalition there, basically 6 women running that country, and they've had a very good, successful attacking coronavirus. They've been very successful in that way. So those were our collective thoughts.
Amazing. Thank you for that, Pam. I love the different directions that the groups have taken this conversation. We have 2 more report outs before I'll ask Carol and Fran to close out the session. Peel, do you mind going next?
So many of the points that were brought up were also discussed in our group. Working through pain and illness and being doers certainly resonated. We quote, someone brought up the quote from Madeleine Albright, women aren't afraid of taking up the lost cause, which I thought was, is very true and has been mentioned. Inherently, women tend to be more relational than and also transactional, which is a huge component of any kind of formation of relationships to get more influence. And that just traditionally, women were the caregivers. You know, if there's less testosterone in the room, we might get more done and act on those relationships. We also, in a different tact, we also talked about the negative connotation that women sometimes have to overcome, even though they have banded together. And really, it sort of comes down to her persisting through the social norm that is sometimes sorry, I'm losing my words, a distraction almost, something else that you have to overcome to gain the respect, to gain a footing on the part of the people that you're trying to influence. Like, oh, it's just a bunch of women, or, you know, you need more women to amplify that message. And to, and particularly the Me Too movement was brought up about, even now, you know, some women are afraid to have their names published, or the questions of, well, if it bothered you then, why are you waiting till now? You know, it's just sort of gaining that perspective, still something that we struggle with. So I thought that was a really interesting way of looking at it. And then finally, we finished talking about the crucial conversations that you can have within your workplace, within your family, as Val had posted earlier, operating within your sphere of influence. And sometimes that's the most effective communication that you can have, is changing one person's mind at a time. So those were the things that came out that were maybe a little different twist than what's already been mentioned.
Thank you so much, Peel. And our last report out will come from Lisa Rodet.
Thank you, Ivana. So we did talk about many of the things that have been touched on. I put a lot of our comments in the chat, so that if Ivana wants to make that part of the recording, you are welcome to it. We talked about women just rolling up their sleeves and getting it done, that there is a practical aspect of women working together, that women bring a tremendous amount of empathy to every movement, task, whether it be social or political or anything else, that there's much less need to take credit, that women often are more than willing to leave their egos at the door and just get what needs to be done. There is a general sense of greater collaboration and much more of a willingness to get the views of everyone around the table. Much more of the, well, what do you think? What do you think? What do you think? The need to be sure that every voice is heard. Then I think Barbara made a great point about the Women's March that people were just generally happy to see one another, that women are very willing to let their personal feelings show in a group of other women, and that they bring their personal feelings with them to whatever the cause is, which I think is a really important point. And that passion often helps fuel the energy that they bring to the cause. So that was pretty much what we talked about.
Well, I just wanted to thank all the facilitators. It sounds like you had some very rich and interesting conversations. And thanks to every one of you for joining on. I know you have many other pressing commitments on your time. I think we've all learned a lot. It's been some great exchanges, and we need to now sit back a little bit and think about, is there something else that the society can do to move these conversations forward? So Fran and Carol, thank you very much. And I think there are a lot of, as Yvonne has just posted, I think there are a lot of takeaways from this. And so we all need to think about how we can help the university and each other in the society to learn and move forward at this most challenging time. So thank you so much and have a wonderful evening.